Welcome back, everybody. It's Ted Gover here. Joining us from Japan, our guest today is Dr. Richard Dyck. Rick is an entrepreneur and scholar who has been at the helm of 5 different companies over the course of his career. He holds the position of chairman of Samsung Electro-Mechanics Japan Advanced Technology Company, and he is the founder of East Asia Connector Services Limited and TCS Japan KK. Rick is also owner and president of TGK-Japan, a company which specializes in semiconductor testing. From 1982 to 1999, Rick was vice president of Teradyne, a Boston-based manufacturer of semiconductor capital equipment, where he was responsible for Asia operations. He left Teradyne when he led a management buyout of the company's Asia-based high-speed connection system business. Rick is a director and investor in Japan Industrial Partners, a Japan-based private equity firm which specializes in carve-outs of businesses from major Japanese corporations. He also serves on the board of Hitachi Chemical and the Semiconductor Portal, a company jointly owned by Rick and Japan's main semiconductor equipment, materials, and device manufacturers. Rick has served on the boards of the Japan External Trade Organization, JETRO, the Tokyo Philharmonic, Nishimachi International School, the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, the Japan-US Friendship Commission, and various industrial trade organizations and government advisory committees. In 1999, Rick was cited by the Japanese Prime Minister for his contribution to Japan's international trade. He supports several projects in Cambodia, including schools, orphanages, and regional hospitals. Rick earned his undergraduate degree from California University, Berkeley, and his MA and PhD degrees from Harvard University. Rick was also a friend and colleague of the late Ezra Vogel, who passed away at the age of 90 in December of last year. Dr. Ezra Vogel was a scholar and prolific author who served as Henry Ford II Professor of Social Sciences at Harvard University. He wrote on modern Japan, China, Korea, and other topics related to Asia. Rick has agreed to answer a few questions about Ezra Vogel's career, in addition to a separate and timely subject, the semiconductor industry. Rick, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you for having me. Thank you for that gracious introduction.
Sure. Well, we're lucky to have you. For those unfamiliar with Professor Ezra Vogel's career, can you share with us a bit about where he came from, his upbringing, and how he began his involvement with Japan and China studies?
Ezra comes from a town called Delaware, Ohio, which is right out of Columbus, Ohio. Maybe it's 30 miles from Columbus, Ohio. He comes from a family, his mother and father were emigres from East Europe. They were Jewish. And he and his sister and the mother and father were probably one of the few Jewish families in this small Midwestern Ohio town. One distinction of the town is that's where Ohio Wesleyan University is, which obviously by the name is a Methodist university. And that's where Ezra was an undergraduate. And his father had a store called the People's Store, which was in the center of town. I think his father, coming from Eastern Europe, naming it the People's Store, he was sort of, it shows some of his ideology, I think. But the way Ezra would describe his growing up is, even though he was from a Jewish family, he attended the Methodist retreats. He belonged to the Boy Scout troop, and they were fairly much assimilated in this small Midwestern town. He didn't go from there directly to Harvard. In the Korean War, he was drafted into the military. As an undergraduate, he majored in sociology, but in the military, he was assigned to a psychiatric hospital. So he spent his Army career in a psychiatric hospital. I think that's actually an important part of what made Ezra what he was. When he went to Harvard, he went into a program called the Department of Social Relations, which doesn't exist anymore. But it was an attempt to bring together social psychology, social anthropology, and sociology together to sort of get a full picture of the components of a society from a family on up to an entire nation. It was an ambitious project. I think the idea was that you would sort of bridge the disciplines. It never quite worked, and it came sort of unraveled when I was beginning school. But one thing that might be of interest to you, Ted, and also because one of his advisors was Clyde Kluckholm. And Clyde Kluckholm's wife, Florence Kluckholm, who was a social psychologist, was also in the program. Clyde had spent his career looking at Native American tribes in Arizona and New Mexico and trying to figure out, from a social anthropologist point of view, what these tribes are like. I think that approach of Clyde also had a big impact on Ezra. After he did his PhD, after he finished his PhD, Florence and Clyde both convinced him that he needed some overseas experience, that he was too parochial. Mm. And they thought, and he thought maybe Africa would be a place, maybe India would be a place. It was almost by coincidence that he decided to go to Japan. He did not know Japanese. He didn't know anything about Asia. And his idea was, his PhD thesis was looking at families in the Boston area that had an emotionally disturbed child, and what happens in the dynamics of a family that has that kind of situation. And he was going to do a study of Japanese families in a similar situation and do a cross-national study. He got to Japan. He spent a year studying Japanese. They had one child by that time. So it was Ezra, his wife, and a child. They spent a year studying Japanese. They got involved with social psychologists in Japan and various people. And then they spent a year literally embedded in a suburban community in Chiba-ken, in Ichikawa, looking intensely at 6 families, some of whom did have emotionally disturbed children, but just living in this suburban community. And this was 1958, 1960. Japan was emerging from the post-war period. It was beginning to gain stride. And what came out of that year of intense field work was a book called Japan's New Middle Class. Ezra sort of discovered that there was a transition happening in Japan from a country of farmers or small shopkeepers to suburban families that commuted to work in large companies, the so-called what we today would call salarymen. And so the study, his first study was on that, the new middle class. He went back to the United States, wrote the book, and then went into he had got an appointment at Yale in psychology. Someplace along the way, he decided that he wanted to go into East Asian studies. So he took another postdoc. By this time, I think he had 2 children. So he had a wife, 2 children. He gives up a tenured track position at Yale to go back to Harvard and study Chinese. so that's the big transition.
Mm.
But just one thing, I don't want to go on too long, but one thing that the social relations department did, they not only looked at sort of the family and the sort of microcosm of what makes up a society, but they had also done a series of studies on Russia. And Clyde Kluckholm was involved in that. So here was this man who had been studying Native American society in New Mexico, is studying what happens to Russians in the Soviet system. Not from the point of view of ideology in the Soviet system, but how do people, what's the art of being a citizen of a Soviet system? And they did these sort of whole country studies. And that, I think, was the model for the work that Ezra did there on out, especially on China.
Okay. Fascinating. And may I ask, how long did it take for him to learn Chinese?
I think for all of us, including you, Asian languages are a lifetime
Yeah.
a lifetime thing. Ezra, so 58 to 60, he did the new middle class. He gets back to Harvard. He starts studying Chinese. And for the rest of his life, Ezra alternated between Japan projects and China projects. And for his entire life, he always had language tutors. He was constantly studying Chinese and constantly studying Japanese. So if he was on a Japanese project, he would have a Japanese language tutor, and he'd be heavy into whatever he was doing on Japan. If it was a China project, he had China tutors. In both Japanese and Chinese, he was functionally fluent. He could give speeches and lectures in either language. And especially his writing and reading was to be envied for those of us who struggle with the written language.
Huh.
So he could especially do interviews in either language. And that's really, most of his work was not library research, it was interviews.
Some of Professor Vogel's books on Japan, in particular, Japan is Number One and Modern Japanese Organization and Decision Making, made a significant impact on the way that non-Japanese organizations viewed the practice of management and the running of business. What sort of lessons do these books hold for the United States? And are there still specific organizational structures and conscious planning and policy programs in Japan that America can learn from today, in your view?
Yeah, instantly for the book on organization decision making, that came from a conference, and I was the rapporteur at that conference.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Yeah, I helped organize the conference and helped edit some of the articles. Even though there's kind of a similar intellectual framework in the work Ezra did on Japan and China, the audience and the mission of the books were different. The organization and decision making, and also Japan is Number One, were written in the 1970s. And the concern which Ezra had in the 1970s was about the United States. The United States, we had Watergate, we had the Vietnam War, and then the winding down from the Vietnam War. I remember I was teaching at Ohio State in the mid-1970s. In the state of Ohio, we had double-digit unemployment in almost every Ohio county. And a lot of it was blamed on competition with Japan, especially in the steel industry, like in Youngstown, Ohio. And what Ezra was, I think Japan is number one, is often misunderstood. That book was written not to praise Japan. It was written to show that the Japanese, in some cases, had found something that is worthwhile for America to look at. Not necessarily to copy, but to look at. In the 70s, I think it hit its mark. It sold about 50,000 books in the United States, sold 500,000 in Japan. But in the United States, I think that a lot of people and a lot of companies did get a sense of crisis. And they began to look on Japan not just as an enemy or a competitor, but also someplace that they could learn from, especially in areas like quality control. So Ezra in the 70s spent a lot of his time going around the country, giving lectures, and it was part of a number of people. You remember in the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, we started things like the Baldrige Award, which was an award to companies for quality control. We started looking more at Japanese approaches to quality control. And I think Ezra's book was all part of that. Actually, when he wrote Japan is number one, a lot of us advised him not to publish it because it wasn't a really academic book. And but he was on a mission, and he really wanted to shake America up and make us understand that we can learn from other countries. I think it had its impact. I think it had a lasting impact. Certainly I did my Ph.D. thesis on the semiconductor industry and ended up spending my career in semiconductors. It had a huge impact on the semiconductor industry. The reason is one of the sort of original thoughts which comes out of Japanese quality control, and it comes directly out of the semiconductor industry, is that you're not trying to make a better product. You're trying not to make a defective product. And the semiconductor process itself has yields. It's a curve of good devices and bad devices. And the thing is to understand your defective products, to analyze your defective products so you know what's happening in your production line and you correct it. Which in the US semiconductor industry at the time, that is the early 70s, most of the applications were for military or for the telephone industry. And they would just discard the bad semiconductors, figure out what good was coming out, and then they would price accordingly. So the price of a device could be quite high because the fixed costs are high. But the Japanese were trying to develop semiconductors for consumer devices where price was important. Therefore, where a US semiconductor factory would be satisfied with a yield of maybe 60% or 65%, the Japanese were looking for yields of 90 to 95%.
Mm.
And they got it over time. That was a shock to the US industry. And now the approach in semiconductors that all companies use is basically what originally was the Japanese approach.
Mm.
Constantly looking at the defects and analyzing them.